feeling refreshed and a little bit relaxed and have enjoyed this morning's sessions and are ready for an afternoon filled with inspiration and an opportunity to network and learn from group discussions. You're very lucky because the next session, Deep Dive, the Tempest, also includes a live Q&A in the spaces area of Hopin. Sorry about that, tongue-tied there, where you can post your questions in the Hopin chat also. So as I said earlier, I have had a little bit of a sneak preview and it's a brilliant one.
Welcome, Samantha. It is really, really lovely to be connected with you in this pandemic time on our Zoom squares. You're the artistic director for Tender Claws, and actually I'm a big fan of your work and what you've achieved this year. And obviously coming from the world I'm in with Shakespeare, massive respect to you for your work. And it's great for us to have a little bit of a fireside chat together about you know, the play, I thought, actually. And let's start with what a wonderful play The Tempest is. And today for you to share your vision behind why that play, why now, and your approach to it in your work. So I'd love to hear what made you choose The Tempest to create The Tempest in VR.
Yeah, of course. So there's kind of a two-pronged response. One is kind of why we chose to work in VR in that format, and that kind of it will probably touch on that, but that ties back 3 years ago to us starting The Under and how that naturally kind of evolved into The Tempest. And then the other is why we chose the text of the play. So very quickly, and the first kind of guise is Under was running with live actors every day since around November 2019. And when these are people that I had been working with, you know, directing, The Under a lot is different than The Tempest. It's a lot of devised theater using viewpoints method, a few other kind of methodologies that we created together for working with actors in, you know, virtual space. And The Tempest is a 45-minute scripted performance where I actually delved deep into the mythology and the text of the play. And then we created opportunities for improv around that. So they're two very different structures. However, I had been working with many of the cast for that long, and then COVID started to hit. And The Under was naturally supposed to wrap up its first live run. And I wanted to find a way to in the systems we have in the US to kind of support and find funding for my cast, because a lot of their previous jobs were starting to shut down. So we decided, we're like, okay, well, what if we, you know, tried, you know, this model, and then we could create more opportunities for them to perform. But I knew that I also had wanted to do something, because The Under is still running. It's been running every day, you know, and there's a huge mythology, you know, world that kind of evolves and builds on itself. But I'd wanted to try to write something that was more scripted, and going back to my training in literature and theater, combining those sort of themes. So that's where part of The Tempest came in. The choice of The Tempest was actually also goes back to The Under, because The Under is very much, there's a sort of a proprietor or MC of that space who's a sort of wizard type character who's, you know, in charge of kind of the fate and free will and, you know, the text of how The Under unfolds. And there's a fascination with this idea of time cycles and shipwrecks and kind of, you know, these lost moments of voyages that keep repeating and keep getting on loop. There was also this idea of the spirits. You're kind of these sprites, these time sprites in The Under, and they're spirits that help enable the world and kind of have this relationship with this MC and, you know, do the bidding, but also have their own agency and free will. So those themes started to kind of seep into thinking about the version of The Tempest and some of the themes that were in The Tempest, as well as, I guess it can be say that, like, what is the nature of the artist in this current age? And The Tempest, you know, sometimes is, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, but is regarded as like Shakespeare's, you know, kind of bowing out to his audience, especially in the final monologue with Prospero. And when I was thinking about what live actors could bring as sort of the wizardry or the kind of curator of this, experience, I sort of saw like this parallel between the role of the live actor in, this live theater and, Shakespeare, and kind of how this was going to come together. The other theme that wove into the beginning of the play was the Decameron. And the Decameron is a very early novel, and that actually happens around a bunch of young, it's before Canterbury Tales, a bunch of kind of young people in a mansion waiting out the bubonic plague and telling each other stories to keep entertained during quarantine. So that was another thread that was woven into the text. And the general premise of the play, going across those threads, and I can answer some of the questions to dig deeper into it, was that you were with, there was a brief breaking of the fourth wall. You're with the live actor at the start. They kind of tell you a little bit about their context or their situation. Depending on who it is, there's 11 different actors. It can be personalized in different ways. And then they kind of talk about this parafictional play of the Tempest that they were supposed to be in, but it never got off the ground in COVID. So then as like a sort of Prospero character, they lead you through the imaginings of what the play could have been. Ending with this sort of going back to the place you started, which is a mansion, quarantined, and ending with that spot to kind of like talk about, kind of bow out and leave the audience behind and say, I've performed for you, my spirits, it's happened because of you, and this sort of acknowledgement of the live and the audience coming together.
I mean, I did it, and I absolutely felt those things, and it's wonderful to sort of hear you talk about the Under and the Tempest and the sort of world building sort of that you've been doing over this period of time, but also to look at a text that's 400 years old and completely land that in a new world, in a new space. I mean, it being Shakespeare's last play, arguably one of his most innovative plays, and you to completely find the sort of cultural, not only the cultural reference points for that now, but also what I'd argue is the artistic process points. And I wanted to sort of drill in a little bit more around how it was working with the actors. And, you talked about holding that space narratively just then, but how was that experience for the actors? How did they feel behind the scenes with their audience?
Yeah, there's a few interviews out there with actors as well, and like it's so fascinating to hear them, talk about the process. I feel like we've all been through a journey together. For the Tempest, it's an interesting process because they had been performing in the Under, some of them not necessarily every day because they have different shifts, and they had different gigs as well, but they had been performing in the Under after like this whole training process we went through together for like a month, probably from November, December, January, February, March. Yeah, about 5 months they had been performing live in VR before we started this process of the Tempest. And when I went to them and I was like, hey, we're gonna get this off the ground relatively fast, but I think that it's going to be a different, interesting experience. Are you game for it? They, a lot of them were really excited, and they kind of like delved in, were like, all right, let's do this. And, it was a different process than the Under, which was again, like working with them to develop characters and mythology and world and more devised. And it started out with like a script and a talk through of these themes and thinking about how we wanted to like actuate this character of Prospero. When we did the Tempest, they had to like kind of learned, they read the play if they hadn't already, because not everybody is coming from a traditional theater background. They're all extremely skilled, but we have a professional opera singer and clown who's amazing. Her performance is very different than someone who is a Shakespearean trained actor, right? So there was a lot of talk through what the Tempest was and its themes, as well as learning the script. And I think I'm going to release the script, but you can see all the different pieces of it come together and which parts are devised, which parts, I've asked them to add their own unique individual flourish to it. It was, I think, a little daunting to approach a large text and like a 45-minute script. And there's usually like 4 levels of kind of working with the text and getting into the performance that also relate to the technology. Because part of what I do is I also design the interactions, and I do code with my partner and team as well. So first learning the text, getting a hold of the script, kind of understanding the different like main beats, and then they have to kind of be able to get into the world. And as it's like creating a theater while the stage is being constructed under you, right? So they get into the world, and then they have to be like, okay, these are the kind of environments, enough of the script, go, like, let's just like, they kind of work with we did it like scene by scene breakdown. And then, we worked with what it meant to like string together the beats after that. And then the most important and difficult aspect to account for is the addition of the live unpredictable element. And your audience will always be different. So that's sort of the 4th level of adding it onto their training. Each of these steps has like different degrees of breakdown. So I could, I'm happy to go into depth and what that is, and even say like the kind of the top 3 methodologies that we've thought about for working.
Please do, because that is, I think, so insightful for, I think, us as a community and an industry to really understand that. And I love the fact that you just said the unpredictability of when you put it with a live audience. I think that's the bit, I think, with live performance, that's the real spirit of it, and how you all of those methodologies lead towards that. So I'd love to hear a bit more about that in the terms of the detail, and then how they felt when it became live.
Yes. Oh yeah, that's the other component too. So one of the first things we talk about, and this especially in the under, is this idea of liveness. And I think in digital theater, so what I did is I have a background in I created a degree in digital theater, and I taught that at RISD for a number of years. Now I'm at Northeastern, and I teach in games and theater. And the thing that I tell my students is what is liveness to the digital medium, right? Like, what is the difference between something that's like pre-recorded and responsive, and this feeling of presence. So in the under, one of the things we want to do, we didn't say there were live actors initially, but we worked on this idea of these expectations of NPC characters and what NPCs in a digital environment are supposed to be and do. And then because actors can possess these NPCs, essentially this idea of opening up loops of liveness within these pre-recorded kind of tracks of behavior or repetitions that like make the attention shift and the focus shift of the audience, where you suddenly feel that full attention of the movement of the body, of the gaze, of like the kind of like call and response, like, you're upping it gradually, where someone is saying like, it's not just like, hey, over here, but like, suddenly someone's on stage and they're doing a kind of performance, and then an audience like, puts a bottle on the stage and like is offering them a drink, and they pick it up and they're like, oh, thank you. It's like these kind of moments of breaking out and expectation. You just see like the gestures of the player just like lose their mind essentially when they realize they're with another human, and that takes the air of the room. So like this idea of presence and liveness. Then there's the idea of being able to boundaries. And that's something that's really important for any immersive actor, but especially an actor in VR, especially a multiplayer game like ours, which is commercially released as a game. What is crowd work? What does it mean to capture the attention of a group and make everybody feel seen, make sure that they have like, time and they're doing an activity? But occasionally you have, outliers of energies that are, either disruptive or they really want to test the boundaries or limits of the system. So we were kind of looking at, as a famous drag performer, and I really should remember their name, but looking at drag performance and hecklers as a way of like recognizing audience energy and kind of like encompassing that. And, there's 3 different ways they can do it. They can try to bring it into the performance. They can try to acknowledge it, let it be seen, and kind of shift the energy towards that. Second level, they can often ask the energy to not, be as disruptive. And sometimes other audience, we have spells, they'll spawn shields and swords and protect the actor from the heckler. Or there's a third level where they can even ban disruptive audience members. So, but it's important to set the boundaries clearly with the audience up front. And then the third one is invitation and address, which is basically about audience attention and how in the magic circle and how you make them feel welcomed into the experience.
The invitation I felt was A, really magical, and B, really inclusive, and the multi-layers of participation and togetherness was really clear in the Tempest, but also so considered. And it's great to hear in a bit more detail that sense of actor presence and liveness and connection with audience. One of the things that we've really learned on Audience of the Future when we've been doing some audience research on it is that audiences, particularly at this time in a pandemic, are craving connection and togetherness more than ever. And kind of like the Tempest really brought that out, I thought. And when you look at traditional theatre stage direction and using lighting and sound to move the attention on stage to make your scene changes, and all those connections were there. And it feels like the actors, by doing it as a run and by doing it over time, what do you think that they've learned through that experience of doing this over a significant run? Because you've been running for quite a few months now, if not the whole year, right? No, it's been...
Yeah. The Under's been running all year. The Tempest ran every day with multiple shows from mid-July to the end of September, and now we have a special version for Rain Dance. I think they've all, depending on their training, have learned different things. One of the actors, it's interesting because some of them have never played video games before. So they're also adapting to this kind of like interesting interface of puppetry and being in a virtual world for the first time. And I think this idea of being in the virtual world, and I think a lot of what from a theater point, what they've told me they've learned is people who had less training in maybe clowning or gesture vocabulary, they're picking up cues, how to pick up body cues and language from the audience in a way that, like, when because it's so focused and honed, not necessarily in the real world where there's a lot of different stimuli, but it's really about the body and presence. And there's such a thing as like a tilt of the head is listening, kind of how the gestures in relation to the hand and the head can communicate so much about the physical energy of a person, and how they can like read the audience on if they want to really be included or if they'd rather hang back, and it's addressing a show to multiple different perspectives at once, which I think is one of the skills that they're most, picking up and thinking about. But in relation, there's also this kind of almost, I don't want to say spiritual, but emotional journey they've been on. Yeah. And that's the other element. So the example I gave of, there's one person in particular who had never played games. And then the thing about the Under, which is fascinating, and this fed into, I think, the success of the Tempest, we have a really strong, active community that are very, they much of the time live on Discord. They're very active in the lore and create fan art and they follow, it's different because it's given the actors an audience and an immediacy that they usually wouldn't have in theater, and access to immediate feedback from their performance. And that is something that's become extremely addictive to them. And because even if you're building something over time, the way that one of the actors described it is you're basically you're like, okay, the show runs now and I'm building this part of the world. And then 4 months, the show will run again and we'll build out part B of the world. But now they're building it in real time with immediate feedback. that of their audience that is then feeding into their performance in the next 2 hours. So it's like such a rapid development. And that sort of addiction and feeling and closeness of connection with an audience, especially now during COVID, is extremely powerful. And I think for me, the biggest trouble I had as a director was I actually kind of, in the nitty-gritty, overlooked that for a second. I had to step back and think through it, because one of the actors, when we were doing Tempest, their shifts were less as they were rehearsing, and their audience was missing their presence, and they started to cry because they felt like it was their friends and they were separated from their community. And like, I was like, oh shit, you know, this is real. Like I need to step back and respect this process for them, because it's gotten really intense, you know, in a way that like it's been transformative. And I think I saw the very last show of the Tempest. There's ways I can, behind the scenes, I can like give them invisible, like there's a channel I can talk to them, I can give them directions. I usually don't, to not, you know, interrupt their flow. But I was with one of my actors in one of the shows they were doing, and they left, and there was the Tempest now closes by consensus in COVID with a group hug. Most of the time, everyone closes it with a group hug. And then they left, and the audience kept hugging. And when they got returned to the theater, they all started spawning these magic roses and laying it on the theater in these virtual roses, and just like bowing to this actor. And I just like started crying. It was like exceptionally moving. So yeah.
I have a litany of questions for you around this. One of the delightful things I'm hearing right now, and it's so wonderful to hear, is that there are just some preconceptions from people outside of this community, particularly in the mainstream world, about the lack of connection. And everything I've heard from you is about emotional connection, agency, togetherness, liveness, and the spirit of that. And it's a wonderful thing for us to talk about and hear, and actually know that it's different, and it's but it's at the heart of it is so true to theatre. As a director, I would love to ask you what you've had to hold this, and so like you were talking about holding, you know, you're holding all of this together in many ways. What's been the most delightful and what's been the most challenging part of that process for you as a director?
I think the most delightful thing as a director is honestly actually connected. Like I usually don't talk about it in these terms, but it's like that emotional journey I feel like I've been on with this group of people and this community, and that sort of connection that was there, and then, you know, with COVID get even more amplified, and seeing that being in a privileged position to just like see that change and the effects of the world through these lenses and in that way has been really powerful. I think as a writer, I think it's more, that's where it's been a little stranger for me, because, you know, I created this world, set parameters, you know, worked with the characters to start, actors start devising characters and everything. And then when it's out in the wild, and it's like the fiction and the parafiction, you don't know, it just all merges, and suddenly like this world you created is living and breathing and evolving in ways that at first, like we were like, okay, well, we, you know, 3 years we worked on this project, these are the parameters, we should stay in that, you know, we talked to all the actors about the constraints and the world lore, and there was like they all were like really into the world lore and a big debate about what was right or wrong in it. And then finally, like by the end of it, we're just like, okay, you know, this is fully belongs to the community that's been with us so long that it's just kind of grown way beyond what I could track as a writer. And there's things that happen like left and right that I'm just like, that's crazy, but sure, I guess. So like that was both, I think that's been the most crazy and transformative experience. What's the hard thing as a director, I think, is keeping track. Like I can't possibly be in every show every day, you know, and just like the actors, because we have this trust and I trust them, it's a lot of it, is like kind of like, okay, do what you need to do in the, in the moment that you feel like you're bringing the show to life and you're bringing this audience to life. And, there's a lot of kind of like, almost giving this creation over them and like, go with it. And it's, I think establishing trust, it's hard to, I think, because I'm not just a director, but I'm also studio lead, and there's, unfortunately, like, we're small, but we had to have people to help with community management, because there can be like, you don't expect the amount of like customer community management in a digital production if you charge for it to take up so much bandwidth in support. And like, that is something that I think is not really accounted for or thought through, but it's really important to be present and there for your audience. So we actually, some of the actors also got extra jobs as stage managers. And I think, yeah, it's really difficult to be on top of everything just popping up at every second. And to make sure that, accidentally, for instance, we had earlier a UI that had like the go invisible inadvertently close to the band player, so that the actor accidentally would hit band player, and then that would cause like a huge thing, and then we'd have to unravel it. So like, it's that part as a director you're not usually used to engaging with. Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack.
Killer question every time. But it is that, like, as writer and director, you hold so much, and there is so much responsibility in that. But with the writing of it in particular, like, you're learning, it's evolving, isn't it? It's a living text, effectively.
Yeah.
It's a living stage. It's a living text. Really. And again, that goes back to live performance, and the principles around live performance is that we think every show is the same. That's not true. Like, we think all the rituals we have around the theatre that I'm virtually sat in, we make assumptions and take for granted, but the weather impacts how an audience feels. It affects the pace of the show, the actor's connection, the air you're breathing, all of that. And again, wonderful to hear from you in this virtual co-presence that we're having. All of that is there, in that messy world of creativity is emerging through the under and through the Tempest. Do you think now, reflecting back and looking at yourself as a writer and a director, the next piece that you will do, what takeaways are you going to take into that next part of your process from what you've experienced this year?
Yeah, it's so hard because there's a variety of different pieces. There's definitely another theater piece I want to do, not necessarily in this format, but in the near future. And I think I guess like some context is probably helpful in this answer, is that part of our background as a studio comes from conceptual art and fine art. And in that training, there's different degrees of understanding and creating art for audience versus creating art not for audience, right? So some of it, I think, is as a writer and director, a bigger attentiveness to audience and the impact of audience in creating a living text. Even if one of our projects is like a game that is a single player game, it's still a living text based on, agency, like everything about interactive narrative, right? So really, I think thinking about how an audience emotionally resonates with a work, and what is up for what connection may mean, in that moment, I think is something I'm definitely taking forward. There's probably like a few other things, but I have to think through them.
Love it. And it's it's that iterative process. I'm sure Tempest will go into your thinking around your next piece of work, and that agency and that connection, and like you say, the world building that you're doing through narrative, and how you're taking that through, and taking clearly a Tender Claws community through as well, like, and looking beyond, like, it seems to me, just about device or platform, but actually about where story can land and where you'd like those stories to land. Would that be fair to say?
Yes. Yeah, our kind of focus is, it's not so much on, even though we've worked across different platforms, it's we're interested in kind of when things are nascent and emerging, and like exactly how story can land and kind of innovate and provide opportunities that are like different than what is like in America, which is a very metric, corporate driven space. How do we actually push that and innovate using story in different emerging tech? And I think in terms of, there was something that I was going to say. Oh, in terms of what's scary for me actually is the when you said that bringing the community forward, that is like a lot of pressure, on director and writer. So that is the thing that is the most scary.
So funny, isn't it? Because from a community perspective, they're not scared, they're just excited.
Yeah.
But from your perspective, you're like, pressure. It's like, but community is really important, and it's really important to theatre, and it's really important to live performance, I think, in particular, isn't it? Because community is how you as an artist have a conversation about your work. And so when you talk about it being a pressure, it's because, again, you're having an ongoing conversation about the ideas that you've put out there, because that is the whole nature of what theatre is about. It's about a convening of a story, a convening of an idea, and using different platforms and where people are. When you talked about your community being in Discord on Discord all the time, it's the convergence from mainstream to emergent communities, for me, is super fascinating. And I think that what Tender Claws have done with the Under and with Tempest is to provide a bridge in that way, and that's super fascinating. Do you feel you've met through the Tempest any new communities that are fresh to this, and have you seen those communities blend in the run at all?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. This is actually one of the first conversations I've had with someone else in theater. I do have like conversations in theater, but we're operating between theater and games. And I think that there's now more than ever an interest in that confluence. But they're all different. There's different kind of, there are different industries with different understandings and processes, right? So I'm really glad to help to bridge that. But I think there's there's a lot of nuance in terms of like great, collaborations. And then like, I think like each could benefit by being more open-minded about the other, in a summary. So, yeah. And I think that, I'm constantly running into that wall. And I think part of what I'm an educator, and part of what I do is try to bridge the dialogues between those communities, as well as like the expectations. Like when we're talking about audience, it will mean something very different theater than games. And I think it's important for theater people to know that I am also talking about a game audience, and they have very intense expectations and involvement in a way that is, I think sometimes, there are super fans, of theater for sure, but can be, it's a little bit, different how you like learn to, approach and handle and support your audience.
That's right. And it's really interesting, coming from the world I'm in, to hear that from you is a huge amount of solidarity, because in some ways, through collaboration, we're finding the edges of what's possible, and through the edges, we're finding what's interesting and finding, new ways of making our work. but it is that convergence of community, but also not just in audience, but in process and in making, and the people you're working with, that those conditions for that to work, and also potentially change the way people are working, need again, from a director or a writer perspective, or a producer perspective, needs to be held and understood. And what the promise of theatre is, or the promise of a game is, you're kind of moving in you're shifting, and it's such an interesting time to bring those particular industries and forms together, because they're so community led, I think. And maybe that's why we naturally as makers are attracted to those spaces as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. My biggest fear is that I think, if there's an upside of COVID for the creation of theater, it's that there's more, these things that were, I think, evolving probably over many years is just suddenly sped up, right? Like there's suddenly interest in like sustainability for these practices, and what does it mean to work in the digital realm in ways that if I had talked to like a year ago, a traditional theater person in my department, would be very different than their interest now.
Right.
And I want that interest to continue even, after we eventually get into normal life. And I worry that the translation of models and understanding of like how to, because a lot of times they're interested in like maybe ticket sales or things like that. And like, it's a different kind of adjustment and model. And I worry that if that isn't sort of, like there's not a sort of understanding or desire to try different models, then they'll just be kind of go back to what they were doing before, which is, fine. But I think that there's so much like innovation and experimentation, open-mindedness that can come from sticking with it.
I couldn't agree more. I feel reflectively, like again, at the RSC, but also with our Audience of the Future project, with looking at live performance, is I couldn't agree more around the accelerated disruption that we've all experienced, but also the huge amount of change and the vulnerability that comes with change, but also the opportunity that comes with change. And it feels now more than ever really important to hold that space in order to make sure we stay together, and that sense of respect and solidarity around risk and innovation, and not always about solution, but being on a trajectory to move it forward. And artists do that brilliantly. They look at, they hold space and take risk all the time in whatever work goes out. And it strikes me, the more heterogeneous we are about this, the less homogenized we are about this work, the more questioning we are about it around artistic and commerciality, and test that with really firm research questions around that, we can converge our communities as well. I think what I've seen working at the RSC is such a curiosity from our audiences and communities, who have been with us for long amounts of time, and have such rigor in thinking around the work and respect for new work coming in. I think our worlds are closer than ever together, and it's how we architect that together, isn't it? What do you think is one of the sort of opportunities around that accelerated disruption? What do you see as hopeful in where we're at now?
I think you articulated it really well, is a focus on an acceptance and awareness that we need to embrace part of risk in an uncertain time to move forward and to have an actual upward trajectory. Because if we only focus on, I think, the pragmatics, or like what is, there's no silver bullet or recipe. And I think like every few weeks, there's somebody who contacts us for consulting that wants a recipe, for how to create theater and how to get audience in this space. And I think it's about disruption at this point, and like innovation and R&D and work. And if we're willing to put in the work, I think that there's a lot of promise for what theater, can look like in the future. And that isn't, I think there's a lot of anxiety sometimes from theater about, oh, it's going to be disruptive and, theater is going to go away. There's not going away. It's a beautiful live form. It's going to be here, it's so like, that's not, I don't think that's, if anybody who's actually really working in the field, that's not a real concern. And I think that, there needs to be a little bit of like less anxiety about the old things changing and more keeping these forms that have been existing for thousands of years, but also looking towards the future simultaneously.
I couldn't agree more. And it's exciting. Yet I think it's what I've recognized is how we enable our industries, our sectors, our communities to have the skills and the opportunities and the access that we have as makers currently, and how do we democratize that? How do we, upskill areas and give opportunity for practitioners and people who have tremendous stagecraft to share their skills as well, so that we can keep inventing and keep challenging and keep providing stages for our artists, and also, like you say, build those relationships with actors and performers to get that feedback loop in. That work evolves in consultation, in concert with our performers and our designers and our audiences. If you were reflecting back on this year and all the sort of highlights, and if I asked you to give me one final answer to one final question, what moment of the Under and the Tempest, what was the, and I'm reflecting back on the themes of the Tempest in particular, what would be the most magical moment for you that you'd take away into 21 and going, I want to keep that in a box, I'm going to take that and I'm going to take that with me?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to drop. I think that the thing I mentioned with the virtual flowers is definitely at the top of one of the things at the top of my list. However, the way that a world that we created has now inhabited a space where people have found each other, because there's a lot of people who have made friends through it, despite the fact that the Under is the audience is all silent, and have actually met up, and they've started to create their own VR chat performances inspired by the Under. So they're kind of going into these areas, and exploring, and a lot of them are actually seeing theater and immersive theater for the first time, or interested in it because of the Tempest. So that's super meaningful. There was, for instance, a father and daughter who spent about 300 hours together in the Tempest, or not Tempest, sorry, in the Under. So there are real people that are living in this world you've created, and that's just, it's beyond anything. So
that's beautiful. I think that is the most wonderful thing to take into 21, people and connection. And it's been an absolute delight to hear more about your work and what you've experienced this year. And I hope we'll see more next year and be part of your community with you, and I hope that community grows. So thank you, Samantha. And
thanks so much, Sarah. And yeah, it's great to talk beyond
too, right? Great to talk beyond. Hello everyone. Hello Samantha.
Hi Sarah.
Nice to see you, stranger. And we have no idea who is here. Oh, hello Emma Cooper. We're going to go live. That's what it's about. You will have just seen me and Samantha talking, and it was a pre-record. And you'll note by the growth of my roots that it was some weeks ago. And it's lovely to see you all here now. Well, I can't see you, but it's lovely to connect with you all. And we're going to take some questions for the next 45 minutes. And I have to say, Samantha has been my biggest guilty pleasure in this last few weeks. And we had I hope you will have enjoyed the talk, and yes, hearing lovely stuff. Lovely. It's really nice to get the chat going. A lot of us talking about liveness at the moment, and I have to say it's that connection with audiences that we create and with each other. And it's lovely. Do say hi, be busy on the chat, let us know who you are, where you are, what you want to say. And we are going to embark, well, I'm going to ask Samantha some questions, which is a great pleasure. And we've got we've got some that have come through, and I'm going to keep an eye on this chat here as well, to ask some questions, so you can ask questions at any point. I love, Emma, that you want to talk about boring financial questions, but actually it's a really important thing, and it's not boring at all. There's nothing I like more than an Excel spreadsheet with some numbers on it, and there's lots of people around me that are much better. But Samantha, let's kick off our Q&A and go straight to the financials, and how we make this very one-to-one experience at scale, and how you've achieved that through the Tempest, and how we try and take that further to bigger scales too.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot to say about this question, and I really appreciate being at the Beyond conference, because I find in kind of our desire to work towards, theater and the kind of pressure that we're all facing at this time, that it's less about the work and more about the anxiety of, how to produce the work. However, I do think that is an important component. So I think thinking through like the best way to drill at this topic is in part of context. And when we created the Under, it was like a few years ago, and we pitched it as a project the way that it was released. And it's interesting because, in the US, we don't have the same sort of scaffolding and grants and support as, other places in the world. So then as artists, you kind of have to figure out like, how do you, kind of do your best at like estimating how to support yourself and, finding other avenues of support for your work. The Under, it's its own thing. It was a game that was, released commercially. However, the Tempest, when we set about creating it, we knew that we, had to pitch something that could like break even and help support our cast. But we mainly did it initially because we felt it was the right thing to do for our studio and the right thing to invest in, as our actors were no longer able to perform in some of their other sort of venues. And it's, I'm really proud of how it did, but it's an interesting thing because the kind of way we did it on the back end to scale may not necessarily equate to a one-to-one experience in the same way that one could find support for it now. So I would, like, if it's a one-to-one experience in the US, might be different than finding art grants for those type of experiences elsewhere. The structure of the Tempest is meant to kind of float with the audience, where we have a certain number of tickets and a certain number of actors on staff each night, but those can actually kind of adjust and balloon depend on the audience size. And that is the Under, something like the Under is much easier to scale than the Tempest itself, which is, the 45-minute scripted performance. And I think our objective was, we weren't sure what the reception was going to be. So it was to just like keep it even flat to like, either break even or donate some of ourselves to our actors. But it did end up selling out for, more than a month. So it did pretty well. But I think it's an interesting and difficult formula to replicate in sort of this brave new world.
It is. And I think it's fair to say that the ticketing model is not the only model in this construct, subscription, donate, how you find multiple entry points to monetize, so that per person cost
as you look at it in terms of producing live performance, you know, it's a much more complex, you know, we can look at it in more ways than one transaction, can't we? And also the depth of, you know, the additional spend that you can perhaps put into an experience as well. But you're right, to get the, in a way, you need the work out there in order to look at the scale, I think, at sometimes, don't you? And all that, all that sort of stuff. So it can be quite complicated.
It might be interesting to hear for the audience, because, you know, I'm an independent, you know, developer and sort of small, but like for maybe Sarah, from your perspective, for a larger arts organization, there might be other interesting findings.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. What I love about working with people like yourselves based in the US or Canada and the UK coming together is that we do all have different financial models, don't we, and ways of making work. And in the UK, we've been lucky and really supported through R&D, in particular the Audience of the Future programme, and that work there has really established some, I think, some heavy risk taking in these areas and ways we can research and develop and find evidence to commercialize this work. But when you're looking at US models, there's a much more entrepreneurial, slightly different approach. And I think when we come together in those conversations, that's when some really seriously good work and insight can happen. So you play the superpowers of each side of it. But I think particularly recently with the COVID pandemic, it's forced all of us, whether we're institution or independent artist or organization or whether you're tech or arts, to really reevaluate what those models are. And in some cases where the infrastructure isn't quite yet there to commercialize. I think that for us, by looking at scale, what we're trying to do is not negate the level of immersion that you want that experience to be. And sometimes you can feel that there's a tension there between those two facets, can't you? Scale and reach and technology and the possibilities around that, and then what connection you want. So there's an artistic, it's not just a numbers issue, is it? It's also about experience and value.
Yeah, totally. At some point, there's a point of why is it live? You know, it can scale for a long. Yeah, exactly. Why aren't I just looking? You know, but then that's what we've just talked about, isn't it? About liveness, what liveness is, and if we can create a premium around liveness, if we can, you know, educate ourselves and each other to know that connection has a value, perhaps we can look at the monetization a different way. I would just also like to comment before we go into our next question that Samantha Gorman has actually started this call at 5:30 a.m. In LA. So I think she wins as much as all our US counterparts of early starts. And yes, thank you for being here so early, which is really brilliant. But I'm going to dive into our next question and read it off the chat, which is, Samantha, did you notice any new or unexpected roles developed through your work that perhaps aren't yet present or formalized within traditional theatre or game development? Ooh, good question. Yeah, and you know, piggybacking off this, another question is, I'm both from, my original background is in theater and creative writing, but I am also a professor of theater and games. So I also study and create games. It's a little bit of an intersection. And speaking to that intersection is actually where I think the most interesting potential roles come from. In more and more, and this is, Eli I think you'd be happy that I'm calling him out, but we had a kind of a young production intern who was studying to be a producer of games, but he was from a theater and a acting background since he was very young. So it was actually at this fascinating intersection where I realized, with working through Eli through the process of the 2 years of the under, and he's also 19, but the actors thought he was 30 because he was that good. Like, it was ridiculous. Like, he was that good, you know, so he's a superstar, but he really took on this interesting role, which was somewhere between games producer and understanding the interactivity that was needed in terms of, like, you know, modeling, like what we like the logistics of what we had to produce, but also like what liveness was and what interactivity needed to be, but also being able to step in and translate and help translate to actors with me, like the kind of translation that their performances, you know, needed to like create the responsiveness and the agency. So like producers that are this weird hybrid of games and theater, I've found are really valuable in this like fascinating. I hadn't really thought of this question before, but I think it was like, I don't know how to quite describe this role yet, but it was super amazing to, you know, have somebody on staff who could speak to both in the same way.
It's like your interpreter, translator, it's your glue. It's bringing lots of different ways of working together, isn't it? And highlighting why different processes need different parts of attention, right?
Exactly. So there's many people who can translate, and, you know, and even if you are from theater, starting to understand and looking into games, or if you're from games, you know, a little bit of theater, like the more you can translate and kind of have a hybrid background, I think is so valuable.
And sometimes, I mean, also when we look at the notion of expert, we look at very much a depth in one field, but in this space at the moment, it's definitely about hybrid, isn't it? And about convergence and a bringing together of discipline, isn't it, in that sense? And those translators are super important and have a tricky task, actually, isn't it? Because it's not easy to manage that, I should imagine, when you're making. So so my next question is, we have one person asking they'd love to hear more about the writing experience on this project, and we talked about it in our conversation. But as a writer director, do you also think you were a performer in some way? Speaking of hybrids.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question about performance. I think I'm gonna like start to really sit with myself more. I originally was an actor, and, you know, so it's interesting to think about how that might bleed over into like feel. I think it's really feel for like the emotional resonance of a performance that you're kind of envisioning when you're writing too. The writing process is interesting. It's very different in the Underverse Tempest. In the Tempest, I actually was going to release the script for the conference, where you can see like the kind of instructions to the actor and the use of the language and all the different color-coded areas where like improv, and they could like, you know, make it more personal. You know, it started with really attention to the text and the material of the text, and then thinking how to position that in a very short window to get kind of the main arc of the story and the narrative experience. And then really delving another layer onto that, which is imagining like how actors might personalize that and where they can like, you know, improv and where they can kind of devise the theater from that script. And then the next level of how the unpredictability of audience interactivity might layer onto that script. So it's like a very much like tier, but the foundation is still in the material of the Tempest.
And that's brilliant, because Tom Burton is name-checked. Tom Burton is asking how we document, hold on to, and integrate the emotional narrative journey for the audience. So that is brilliant that you're going to share that, because I should imagine that will bring out a lot of that. So it's super important. And going back to your background in games and how you direct a game with interactive live performance, a question here is, do you code as well? So do you cross on that?
Yeah, so I think actually it's super helpful. Granted, I'm from the humanities, and I struggled through this. So coming from creative writing, when I knew I wanted to write for kind of off the page, I actually dug myself into CS courses and taught myself to code. I was never and will never be as efficient in it as like, you know, people who are trained for that only. And it's partially, you know, a little bit because of where my skills lie. But I find it really at object-oriented programming and understanding game engines and Unity to any level, super effective for translation, again, and for communication with a team, and for kind of understanding the parameters of how imagination can be most thoroughly translated. So, yes.
And changing topics slightly, Asti's asking, was Neil Stephenson's Young Ladies Illustrated primer and concept of reactors and inspiration in using live performers the under presents?
I need to look into that reference. When we were first pitching it, we did hear a lot about reactors, as in oh my gosh, this famous novel Diamond Age, I believe, which was, it's the same, oh my God, the blanking out on the guy who wrote it.
It's 5:30 in the morning.
Yeah, I know.
It's more than 5.
But Raptors feature prominently in Diamond Age. He also did like the other famous novel about VR way back in the day. This is, yeah, it's somebody that we've read. One of my favorite authors, and I can't remember their name right now, but that's fine. So yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting reference that I'll have to look into. The primary inspiration was kind of, we had been working in, you know, variations of hybrid theater and performance for a period of time, and looking at how, what liveness was really, and how to bring a body into the space in VR was where we had wanted to start with.
Oh, that's awesome. So Aki from Digital Catapult has a question, which, can you talk about your relationship with Oculus and Facebook, and had there not been any in-app purchases on the platform for ticketing, and how you worked that out with them?
That's actually a really fascinating question, because we created that system. We had to build the ticketing and all the back end ourselves. So I think, and that's partially why the Tempest could happen. You know, and we're a very small team, but, you know, we take the kind of risks and kind of try to work through it is the best explanation. Because there were other, you know, there is an interest. It's not a common model in a store front to put something up right now that is like a kind of ticketed experience, I'd say, because, you know, in the game space, everyone wants immediate content. So having to return to somewhere is a little bit different than typical models for distribution of content now. So we had to kind of work around that and figure it out. And that's one of the reasons that the Tempest is part of the under, besides the conceptual interest to us. So,
but it's a really important point that you had to build it. We hear there's a lot of discussion in the UK in particular about the pressure for the creative at the moment, and how much responsibility is on the creator to make the infrastructure as well as the work. Do you know what I mean? That it is on the shoulders of the creatives at the moment. And how do we as an industry, how do we as a sector not like play to our strengths, and how you were building your stage, your monitor, you know, when we talk about the financials, the monetization and the work and taking the risk, that's a lot, isn't it?
Yeah, I hadn't really thought of it. I'm like, oh
sorry.
Wow. Yeah, that is a lot. In our practice normally, and, you know, sometime I'd like to release some research and documentation on this. We do a lot of tool building, but it's hard to not only produce and create the project and, you know, experiment with the form in a short amount of time for whatever the length of we usually know when we have to release it, you know, months, like years ahead of time, but also create the tools to do it it's a lot. And I think there's going to be more. So there's plus and minuses to this, but I think very soon there'll probably be more readily available tools. But part of what art making, at least I've experienced, is when you're working with a platform, it's a sort of what you can and can't do and can and can't customize. You have to have flexibility, because there'll be things out of the box, and you just have to like use those in, you know, to your best. Work with the constraints as an artistic process, and that's the downside of a platform. But the upside is that it does it can make work more accessible, and it's not the creatives aren't necessarily shouldering the burden of the development in the same way.
And knowing what you know now about that, what's the one thing that you would have brought into that build that you know now that would have be an opportunity?
In terms of
the platform and the building the infrastructure for the experience?
Yeah, it's hard because it's so, a lot of it, sometimes you're in a position where you have to code very quickly and code things that are like very specific to the needs. I think in our tool building, there's a very different thing if you're coding for something that can be generically like reused and made into a module versus something that needs to be like achieve a specific thing in a very short time frame. So if in the magic world of all projects, if you had more time and resources, you would also be able to do everything exactly clean and right. And sometimes in art making or product maker or whatever, it's a little harder. It's a little like a mad dash, so I'd love more time.
Don't we all? Gosh, yeah, that is the key. But if we had more time, sometimes I wonder if it's that thing what gets created in a busy haze is often quite magical. So all props to you for that. Moving it back into the work, did you intentionally mute players to create a safe community? Mm-hmm. So now about the liveness, now about the connection with audiences and how you manage that. So moving from the script now to our audiences, and were there any specific artistic decisions to push more to body gestures and language? Because I noticed there were some really nice physical movements mm-hmm. that we were asked to do. Can you talk to us about that a bit?
Yeah, I think, part of it is playing to strengths. This is a multi-layered question. It's useful to know that when we partnered with Piehole, part of also my interest and their background is in clowning and mask work and all sorts of different theater, for those of you who are interested in theater. But from the game side, there is a rich history of anonymous multiplayer. And I think one of the things that inspired me the most, and this is seeing it years ago, is this game called Journey, which you can, is huge in the games world, and you can clearly see like the loving homage inspiration to it in the under. And the very first time I played, Danny and I, who's my partner, played, and we saw what you think you're playing against is like other characters are coming with you on this pilgrimage, and you think you're playing with an AI, and then you realize through the kind of movements and the communication that that it's a person, and they're another person anonymously in the world with you, and they're not an AI, and they're live. And that moment of transfiguration and that power is like so strong and left such an impression that like that's sort of the edge I had wanted to play with. And it is also a silent, anonymous multiplayer, and the way that frees you for creative gesture and communication can be really beautiful and powerful. So the decision was highly on an artistic level, and then there were other logistical constraints and reasons that made sense for us as a small team. Moderation is one of the factors. But it also really puts people in a field where they're more willing to take risks with each other, and they don't feel the pressure of talking. I think like there's a lot of like in the world of VR chat anxiety of like, well, why can't we speak? And part of it is like, I think, we have people who are young as 12, as old as like, way into their 80s that playing the game together, and it kind of allows for this, this general human element of communication and gesture. And my partner, Danny, is a sort of specialist in thinking about feel and interaction and, like how to create good feel and really worked a lot on the body and the gestures and making that feel like kind of smooth and communicative. And there's a lot of energy you can get from body language. So we recognize that as like a really fascinating strength. And by the time we developed a lot of the thoughts and how to perform with that in the under, and by the time Tempest rolled out, it was purposely like baked into, some of the elements that we had, we encouraged the actors to do, and then they added their own from their own experiences.
And that was one of the joys from the run, wasn't it? That evolved as the run. Mm-hmm. kept performing, and that you got that feedback loop between audiences. And quite importantly is that connection or connectedness in our world is not just about language, it's about being, and it's about the signifiers that we have both physically and verbally, and also looking at the broad range of how we do connect. It's not just a video screen, is it? It's more than that. And you were able to achieve that in the Tempest because people were present and with you. And I wonder, actually, thinking about scale, that one of the real strengths of this piece was its intimacy, wasn't it? Was its connection. And actually to have more would have been much more challenging to then achieve that, right? In terms of that togetherness. And that, again, looking at value of experience is super important, and how we place different values to different forms of performance, and how we look at what people are willing to pay for that in the future as well. So will there be another run, do you think, of the Tempest?
Well, we'll have to see. Not ruling it out, but it's potentially, in the new year sometime.
Spoiler, just but that's great if it's coming back. That would be awesome. And continuing your relationship with Oculus and Facebook, I presume, as well.
I think we would. So the Tempest was partially supported by Oculus, but a lot of it is in our project as well. So I think we would go and either if we did it, it would be like for a special event.
And if you did it again, looking at the leveling up as in games scenario, would you look at it in that way going forward? Would you look at the sort of gaming models as doing it again, or would you look at, do you know what I mean, looking at it more I can't even talk, theatrically, do you know what I mean, in terms of doing the same thing again, or would you iterate it?
I think if we did it again, and that's where the challenge is, we often just also invest. I mean, there's a difference between, we're a little different than I think a lot of PR American startups, and that would, because we're coming from the fine arts, we see value in reinvesting into our projects for, artistic purpose. So our interest would probably be to figure out how to iterate.
Cool. I'm going to flag up Emma Cooper again, because she said something really lovely about what you achieved, thinking of the interactions with the mask were ace, and the different ways that you used that as a tool was magic. And I think, again, going back to iterating or actually with the audience, that is really, really gorgeous. Professor Johnny Freeman has a question. Have you researched the impact on audiences of the experience, what they value most or what they maybe don't value as much, and then the appetite to experience again, like we're trying to get you to put it on again? I think there was big appetite for it coming back.
I know.
I think you've got the audience right now.
Yeah.
There's a few questions in that. But yeah, have you researched the impact of the audiences?
Yeah, it's a hard thing. I'm also, an academic, and in order to properly do this as a research project, it would be structured differently, and it would take much more time. And we had about 3 months from start to finish to get it together. And that is often how sometimes games or other commercial projects, have to move fast, particularly in the US model that we're working in. And, I thought about going back and collecting everything. I tried to keep an archive so I can, write about it in the future. It would be extremely intense to go sort through everything. And, there's a live Discord that has a lot of the community. And for me, it's hard because I believe, if you're doing a research project, coming from academia, you need a proper methodology. And I think there's a lot of antidote, or that we're told about like interest and appetite for it, and what people like and don't like. But I think it'd be great to someday kind of conceal that. But ideally, when you're developing one of these projects, you bake in the methodology from the start. So
I hear you.
Yeah.
I hear you. It's so funny, isn't it, that relationship between academics and practitioners? And and that's one of the joys of Audience of the Future, again, is that I feel like we've become so much closer with academics and researchers and brought them into our process and work, but it has taken us a lot longer to make the work. Like what you're saying is absolutely true.
Yes.
And sometimes as a practitioner you get asked, so what were you thinking when you did this and this, and you literally just go, I wasn't really thinking, I was actually just doing, do you know what I mean, something very instinctive or something very, very of the moment with a 3 months lead in time to make a piece of work. But Johnny's following up now with some connections. I think that after this session, you and him probably can have a glorious chat about audience data and metrics, because he's doing that work at the moment. So I'm sure there's some connections there, and the bridge between your, so you talk about yourself as an academic, you talk about yourself as a practitioner. That's a really interesting thing as a professional in both spaces.
Yeah.
How do you navigate both, or are you just in them all the time? Talk to me about that.
I think for me, usually the line isn't as cut and dry. My current position is I'm assistant professor in games, affiliate in theater department, but my research and work is partially one foot in the industry, and in making, as well as, thinking about writing about work. So it's a constant kind of lived experience, I guess. But I think the thing that's interesting that maybe speaks to the difficulty in this is in the analytics question. So this is what I was saying about baking in methodologies, is because my studio was primarily founded by artists, and we're now like roughly 15, but people in it are still, coming from a much more either production or, practitioner or creative way. And there's a sort of anxiety about we'd never include analytics or tracking in the projects. But from an academic side, there is a desire for me to want to know more about the audience. So I think that is where the tension is. And, as I said, if I was building this from the start as a research project, I'd probably have a different practice to it. So yeah, it's interesting.
No, and it's amazing how much evidence and research we rely on in this space right now, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I just know with the work we've been doing for the live performance demonstrator, how important it is, because we're forging, like, you're building new stages, you're building new content, you're looking at new pathways. That research or evidence or data, they are anchor points for us, aren't they? To reaffirm, to challenge, to have a dialogue about how we get this work out there, isn't it?
Yes, I think it's actually super important, especially for larger organizations too, because I just had realization, because we're even though we do theater, our work kind of bounces between all different forms. So part of the need, usually in a position like mine, would be to like create, US is very metric space, so to create metrics to prove for new projects. But because we bounce a lot between different forms, and it's part of our creative practice and exploration, we don't have the same I guess like structure on us that an arts organization would have in order to produce metrics in the same way, which is important and kind of an interesting look.
And it would be fair to say, just sort of riffing on that, the more open we are and the more sharing we are as practitioners and makers, the more helpful that research is going to be, isn't it? Because you're right, we're riffing off, we're moving from project to project or opportunity, and it's not a homogenous approach that we have, is it? We're not creating a formula for this work.
Exactly, yeah.
You're inspired by an idea, you're inspired by a text, you're inspired by wanting to put something out in the world, which isn't about repetition or the same thing again,
Mhm.
right? And that, would it be fair to say, is one of the most exciting things about being in this space right now, is that you can pivot and change how you're making this work.
Yes, I think part of like the ethos of our studio and our ability to kind of pivot fast is this desire to, before things, because we're coming from, this fine art, conceptual art, and, even like an, academic point of view, is to kind of work with emerging structures and technology before they're codified and before they're kind of locked down, and try to kind of push, what the definitions or like, the industry expects or can be done, and to kind of, maybe help inspire, future projects. So in that way, I feel like there's probably a very, a kind of a window, when a new medium or when different emerging media is coming, where there's not the same expectations of what needs to be done, or at least in the US, where it's so metrics based on what types of games sell, like where there's a lot of like wiggle room to kind of like push, well, like, okay, well, what if we like, really, push this sort of like experimental open narrative. And with the Under in particular, it's an interesting case study because people aren't really sure what to call it or what genre it fits in. So, I think there is room and need for things that sit on that space of being able to not be as cleanly classified.
And it's like you say, the fact that it's not codified from an artist's perspective is incredibly exciting, yet vulnerable. And who do you think we need to make sure we bring with us on that to support us on that journey? So, again, if we go back to the shoulders of the creators and what risk they're taking, without that infrastructure,
Mm-hmm.
without codifying it, who do we need around us to support us to help us get this work out there?
I think it's this a really interesting and difficult space, I think, for creators who are working on trying to figure out how to make this work, because it all comes down to tolerance for risk. And I think that in an ideal world, and this is where somewhere that's very metrics and research based tends to kind of fall short, at least in like games publishing and other, I think it's the same maybe across many different fields, is too much reliance on data points can threaten a willingness to take risk. And partners that are willing to take risk are incredibly valuable, because that is the best way that you can, or one of the ways that you can try to push the medium forward. So, I mean, for us, we're, in terms of like our partnership, at least with, Oculus especially, is due to, like different people like Yelena Richiski, who I should, call out and thank, who was willing to believe in us and take risks as artists. So I think it's really important. I think in relation to that, people who are willing to take chances in trying out the work and speaking about it. And, I think one of the things that matters also is like how the work is promoted, or like the willingness to like showcase things that are outside of normal genre bounds is super, super important as well.
That's right. And for audiences to sometimes know the risk that is
Mm-hmm.
taken, so that when we come together and experience it, we know the care that's been
Mm-hmm.
put into it alongside that. And it felt to me with Oculus that you could tell the care that had been put into it and the support there for it to
Mm-hmm.
get to audiences as well, which is super important. I'm conscious that we only have 5 minutes left, and that we will we've got 5 minutes left. It's your 5-minute call on the chat for more questions on. The conversation will be over soon, so I'm sure you can have a conversation with Samantha about your work and connecting on your work as a writer as well after this session. But are there have we got any more questions before I monopolise Samantha and ask her all my questions to finish with? Because I think creating the Tempest in 3 months was no mean feat, and I know how long some of this takes to make, and I know sometimes you're thinking about all the different pieces of work, but the under is quite a profound artistic statement, isn't it, in this space, and how you look at that ecosystem going forward and how you create that in the future. If you were looking back before you made all of this and what you were excited by, what's the thing that you're most proud of? So over the last couple of years, killer question, it's the perk of the job, but what over the last few years are you most proud of in the making of all of this?
Yeah, it's so hard. It a lot of times, especially like starting a few years ago, it's like stumbling into the dark and then having to like create the path you're stumbling upon, and it's really scary. I'm proud that we kept stumbling. But I the idea is that when you're building that path, you're so focused on trying to build that path that sometimes like the emotional resonance and the toll of and the experience of that emotion and working in a group, it suddenly hits you really strong. And I think I didn't anticipate the extent to that I would feel bonded with the actors and the extent that they would feel bonded with the audience, until it was like hitting me in unexpected ways as I tried to like focus on mostly the logistics of, making sure everything hit the right beats or like keeping it afloat. And that was, I think, really rewarding and meaningful. So.
And final question from Asti, I think, as we look to wrap up, but she's curious about how you funded the development of these projects. And I think through a through line throughout the Day at Beyond as well has been a lot about commercial risk taking and also commercial resilience on this work. And I think there's huge props to being achieved. And if you're willing to talk about that, and especially with the difference between the US and the UK context.
Yeah, I don't know as much about the UK context. I do know in games, for instance, a lot of the more indie and super fascinating, interesting games, and a lot of my friends who are making those games aren't located in the US because they can get, there's the EU or other situations that have a healthy support for risk-taking and arts funding. And that isn't to say that there aren't some amazing projects in the US. So in the US, it's a little bit different in my experience. A lot of it has been partnering with kind of external institutions or platforms as patrons that can help, get the work out, that, they need content for kind of emerging spaces, which is a really interesting time for us because, again, it allows us to like lean into, contribute to the industry in a way that things aren't codified there yet, and kind of like lean into experimentation. That isn't always sustainable, and it isn't always the case as things evolve and technologies progress. I think, for anyone, it's always a constant. There's no clear-cut recipe or clear-cut way to do it. And it's no secret that, many of the early VR projects were funded in part by, Oculus or Google or various, other platforms. And then from there, I think, as I said, we haven't yet taken on other IP other than our own or external work. But we're always, looking for like interesting partners that we can explore creatively. And from there, it's our willingness as artists to like reinvest in our art.
Artist is the entrepreneur,
yeah.
It's fair to say, isn't it?
Yeah, basically.
And risk taker. Yeah. It's incredibly difficult, and I just wonder whether there's no one size fits all answer to that.
Exactly. Yeah. It's so, the more I learn about it, the more I realize there's no real recipe, unfortunately.
It's magic and witchcraft.
Yeah, a little. And
No,
perseverance and luck.
Tenacity and drive. And I think something you picked up, which you've talked about all the way through, a generosity of spirit around your collaborators. You talked about we a lot when you were talking about the production and the actors being part of that commitment and that investment, and how we broke even. And I think that's a really important element of the convergence of the theatre and gaming exercise, as well as it's our success, it's our investment. Do you know what I mean? Together, collectively, can produce those fantastic results, I think. And in the face of financial challenges, would it be fair to say?
Yeah, I'm really proud of. We also I'm seeing things that I wonder about what will happen in the future of theater and, kind of remote work. I'm really proud of the ethics of how we incorporate and we treat like our collaborators who are the actors. And, I do see it as it's not something that we have a bunch of different we're going back to a project we started way before even the Under, which isn't going to be quite the same, but I'm really proud of it, almost in theater, like the ensemble, I guess you could say. I'm really proud of I do feel like in the end, like the Under and Tempest is an ensemble piece. So yeah.
No, I'd say all props to that. And I'd say thank you, Samantha. I think I'm going to end on a couple of comments from the audience, and then I think we say goodbye. I don't know how we say goodbye in that sort of remote way. But from the minute I finished The Tempest, I wanted to know more about this. This has been so useful and interesting. Thank you. Anna, thank you. Says, thank you so much for sharing so openly about your work, Samantha. Really useful in thinking about audience-creator connection. Lots of love, lots of thanks from everyone, Samantha and me, myself. And I think our Q&A has just concluded. So I'll give you a little clap as well.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. So Tara says, join the Story Fellows on the main stage for more insights into immersive projects. The presenters are also going to be in the Story Futures Lounge. So plenty of opportunities. That's us, I think. We're in the Story Futures Lounge. Thank you. Bye-bye. So we then leave. I think we leave now, Samantha. I think we go press leave. Okay, bye-bye. Bye.